Good afternoon. This is Pam Patnode. I'm Senior Executive Advisor at IEM, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Women's History Month, our seminar today on disaster recovery and mitigation. I'm joined by three very distinguished women who have dedicated much of their career to disaster recovery. And I will start with Vanessa Demari. She is actually joining us only by audio from Puerto Rico. Vanessa is currently the chair of the Puerto Rico Builders Association. She's a licensed architect, and Vanessa has been involved in the recovery efforts following the devastation of Puerto Rico by Hurricane Maria. So I've had the great pleasure to work with Vanessa, certainly almost on a weekly, monthly basis with Vanessa for the last several years. We're also joined today by Liz McKay. Liz is the Chief Legal Officer with the Division of Disaster Recovery and Mitigation at the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs. Liz has had a distinguished career. She's certainly a trailblazer that has shattered the glass ceiling. She's a former federal prosecutor. She's a compliance expert, and she has been working on the Superstorm Sandy recovery that occurred more than a decade ago now. It's hard to believe. So Liz, welcome today.
Thank you.
Sandra Gunner. Sandra has been working on the Louisiana recovery from Hurricane Katrina since 2006. I started my career in disaster recovery in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So Sandra and I, we've had some overlap in our career, both as my tenure as Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development at HUD, as well as Deputy Secretary. So I have a few housekeeping issues to cover, and then we'll get right into the questions with the panelists. We encourage everybody to go to GoToWebinar. There's a chat function there if you have questions. Our team at IEM and the comms department will monitor these questions and make sure that the panelists see the questions. The webinar is only been set up for audio and video, and only the four speakers will be on, three of us will be on the panel on the screen, and Vanessa has joined us, as I mentioned, by phone. A recording will be available by the end of the week. IEM will post that and also through Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So again, welcome to all of our participants today. I am asked frequently how I got involved in disaster recovery and how I met the folks at IEM. So 4 years ago, I wrapped up my federal career at the Department of Housing and Urban Development as Deputy Secretary. And a mutual friend introduced me to Madhu Berriwal. She is the owner, she's the president and CEO and the owner of IEM, the largest disaster recovery management firm, headed by a woman in the world. And I have had the great pleasure to work alongside Madhu Berriwal for the last 4 years. And why I chose IEM, Madhu made it very clear from our very first conversation that she's always focused on the disaster survivors. And women who have spent a great deal of time in the trenches in disaster recovery. I think all of us agree that we're all in this business to help disaster recovery survivors to be able to get back to some type of new normal. So IEM is a very data-driven company, and you realize how important data is in disaster recovery when you can't access the data. So we continue to work every day to make sure that we're documenting best practices, as well as when things don't quite go our way in setting up programs. So I shared with you a little bit about how I got into this business. So Vanessa, I'm going to turn it over to you, just because you're not on the screen. I want to make sure we don't forget that you're there with us in Puerto Rico. If you could just talk about how you got involved in disaster recovery as a licensed architect.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us to be in this panel. When Hurricane Maria and Irma hit Puerto Rico in 2017, I was part of the executive committee of the Puerto Rico Builders Association. So as you know, it's known, Maria actually devastated Puerto Rico. So it was tabula rasa for us. It was really, really bad. Being part of the Puerto Rico Builders Association actually got me involved into the disaster recovery aspects or industry. We we started immediately to get calls from the National Association of Home Builders, from people that have actually been involved in disaster recovery before, asking us how they could help us, giving us suggestions. We actually traveled to Washington to meet with them, and we had a whole bunch of people getting to, wanting to help us. So we got this, I got involved 2017, as I think most of Puerto Ricans actually did, since we were so hit so hard by the hurricanes. And actually, the openness from the National Association of Home Builders and the help that we got from HUD, that's how we met Pam also, actually motivated us to keep on going. And that was 2017. I was secretary then. Now I'm president of the Builders Association. So I keep, we're keep involved in the disaster recovery, making sure that Puerto Rico actually gets to be what it used to be before the hurricane hit us.
And that's how Vanessa and I met. The delegation led by the private sector following Hurricane Maria and Irma is why I got so deeply involved as the deputy secretary. My tenure as deputy secretary started on the just after Irma and 2 days before Maria, and just a couple of weeks after Hurricane Harvey. What advice would you give to young women that are looking at disaster recovery? I know I have a dear friend who works for IEM. She's an architect in Puerto Rico, and I'm so happy that she has joined the team down there to work on the recovery. But what advice would you have, Vanessa, for young women looking at disaster recovery as a career choice?
Well, disaster recovery actually involves so many things, not only construction and architecture. It's really, really important. Construction is a male-dominated industry. We know that, but it's really, really important for us to do things that actually motivate us, and we have passion to do it and believe in ourselves. It's a very challenging industry. There's so many hurdles that we need to go through, and many obstacles, but it's so rewarding afterwards to see all of this, recovery being done, starting to get ready. So I would encourage them to keep being motivated, not believe in themselves that they can do the work, and once we take out that perception that we are women. We're not women. We're professionals doing a job that we know how to do. That we are educated. We have experience. Once we understand that, we're going to show it to the world, and people are actually going to accept us as professionals.
Thank you, Vanessa. Sandra, will you please share your journey with our panel, our fellow panelists, as well as our participants today?
Sure, thank you. After Katrina, I was president and CEO of the New Orleans Chamber at the time, and so we ramped up to do what we could for our local businesses and local citizens. I traveled around the country speaking or at the guest of other chambers who wanted to know what the impact was, what could a chamber do, how could they translate that down to information that would be valuable to the employees of their membership. I had also instituted a hurricane summit for the region and had been doing that. But at the time that the state of Louisiana got the allocation, we had been required to put together a separate agency to administer those funds and provide oversight. So actually our office, before it became the Office of Community Development, was the Louisiana Recovery Authority with an oversight board. And they were specifically looking for someone who had experience in regulations and processes, who knew the internal operations of a city government. And I had worked there in New Orleans with the Manpower and Economic Development Office as the director for 6 years under Dutch Morio, who was the first Black mayor. They needed someone that knew the political landscape, who know all the key players, et cetera. And so I was recommended. I had no idea that they were looking for someone. And it intrigued me that on a broader level, perhaps I could make some impact and kind of use my diversification of skills. What I have found in this industry is that you're not one-sided, you're multiple sided in terms of the skill set that you bring, and those come into play at different times. And so I joined as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs and Community Development with the LRA. And it was a daunting task because there had not been such a major disaster in Louisiana in a good while. The city of New Orleans got $418 million in and of itself, which is why they wanted someone specifically assigned to the city to be that liaison and to provide some oversight and direction. We happened to be a small group that they were hiring, and it was a very diversified and passionate group that they were able to recruit. And so we became what we call one team. And while amazingly, while we had titles, we did not have job descriptions. And so we became a team. That's why I became one team, because you had to pull whatever skill set you had to address that particular issue at the time. And it was not a 9-to-5 job by any means. It was a 24-hour job. We frequently communicated in the middle of the night. We frequently had early morning meetings because something had come up overnight. There wasn't any prior road that we could follow with this particular incident. And so we just happened to gel together. And you became passionate about it. You were able to provide, as we continue to do, impact on a broader scale. You have an opportunity to create change. You have an opportunity to really impact lives of individuals, even though you may not know them personally. So this has been an evolution, if you will. Back then, I think that major disasters came infrequently. Now they're becoming almost an everyday occurrence, as you can see over the past few years. I mean, we ourselves, with the 2020 and 21 allocation, those funds are covering Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta, Hurricane Ida, and the May 2021 storms. Look at what's going on in California, crossing over to the East Coast now. And so it's an industry that has developed over time. And there's a lot of opportunity here for people who wish to serve, who say have that old Girl Scout, Boy Scout mentality where they want to be prepared. And so it has its ups and downs. It can be very emotional. It can be very intense. At the same time, I think that it engenders in you that commitment for humankind, if you will, and your own self survival, to make sure that other people who are going through these traumatic events are able to stabilize, to return to some sense of stability, some sense of home and community, because they are displaced. If you think about it, it's not just a physical displacement, it's an emotional one. It's a scary one where you're no longer in that comfort zone. Your relatives are displaced, your neighborhood is displaced, your sense of being has been disrupted. So it just kind of overwhelms you to a degree that you see so much work out there to be done and yet to be done, that it does get to you, and you want to make that change. I'm sure all of the rest of the panelists and you, Pam, also feel that.
Well, Sandra, that certainly stirred emotions in me. I get very emotional when I think back to Hurricane Katrina. I brought a group of interns who have, some of them I've stayed in touch with all these years later, and said that that was a life-changing moment for them to witness, firsthand. And I'm happy to say that 2 of those interns followed somewhat in my footsteps in community development and disaster recovery, because they saw firsthand the devastation. I mean, the news coverage happens, now it's so short, the news cycle, but certainly people need to be reminded of it. And you so passionately shared your journey. Have you encouraged young women to pursue, and I know it doesn't really matter, young men and women, to pursue a career path in disaster recovery and mitigation?
Absolutely. I find that it's fascinating. It provides a lot of opportunity for people who understand the magnitude of this responsibility for response and recovery from these major events and the implication it has for humanity, and the implications it has for not just addressing the current issues, but looking at long-term resilience and being creative, being aware of trends that are going on, not just in your state or community, but nationally and internationally. I must subscribe to 100 different emails or organizations just to keep abreast of what other folks are doing. And this is a area in which you share information. If you can prevent someone else from going through the same missteps that perhaps you did in creating a new program, that's the value of, I think, this type of panel and the camaraderie that is in this industry to share so you can do your best in the most efficient manner.
Thank you, Sandra. Liz, will you share your career journey and what led you to disaster recovery?
Oh, sure, Pam. Well, I had been in the state with the state of New Jersey in the Department of Treasury dealing with procurements and contracts, and had gotten involved in contracts on this side of the house at the Department of Community Affairs with respect to Sandy. So I was invited to come join the effort after working with these contracts for about a year. What's kept me here is basically 3 points. One is, as Sandra's touched on, you're helping people at the worst point in their lives in many cases. And I give the kind of the analogy that if you decide to remodel your home, it is one of the most aggravating experiences in your lifetime. And usually you have your beautiful home and you forget about it. But it's so complicated and aggravating, and things don't work smoothly as you envision they will. Well, imagine if you didn't ask for this. You didn't intend to go out and remodel your home, but all of a sudden your home is devastated, is in need of repair. It's got to be one of the most, if not helpless points in your life. So I think that's tremendously satisfying. What's also satisfying, though, now is the efforts toward mitigation. And it's not often that you think of government as being proactive as opposed to reactive, but with respect to FEMA, for example, we have a couple of grants through the FEMA mitigation assistance to elevate homes because in frequently flooding areas, because FEMA's realized that for every dollar that they spend in insurance, in recovery, every dollar they spend elevating saves $6 with respect to insurance costs, so the cost of elevation. And it's great to see now we have funding for Hurricane Ida, that 15% of the funding from HUD must be set aside for resiliency. So I think that's great. And then lastly, I think intellectually, this is so interesting because it is evolving. The rules are changing. We're writing the rules as we go along. Every disaster is different. So I find that very exciting. And as you pointed out, Sandra, you kept using the word opportunity with respect to a career here. And I think that's one of the keys, because unfortunately, this is a growth industry at this point, and it is still evolving.
Well, thank you for touching on the mitigation too. Like you said, government is not proactive, but Hurricane Sandy was really the first time that the federal government used mitigation dollars. I believe there was $1 billion set aside from that appropriation. While we're on the subject of mitigation, can you just touch on some of the success that the state of New Jersey has had? And I know they probably didn't get all of that allocation because that hit a region, but have there been any projects that have come online as a result of that investment in mitigation?
Yeah, we've have a program which we're continuing. We started with Sandy, we're continuing with Ida, which is called the Blue Acres program, in which the government will come in, purchase your home or it has to be a swath of homes. It's not just isolated, homes here and there. A swath of homes, and will pay you pre-storm value for your home, and basically just with the thought that you probably shouldn't have built there to begin with. And Sandy was pretty much a Jersey Shore phenomenon. So we'll buy those homes and then just let the land become, preserved land for, for just nature, for the use, for the enjoyment of the local people. We have also from the Rebuild by Design competition, we have $200 million was awarded for Rebuild by Design in Hoboken, which is a major city in New Jersey, as well as the Meadowlands. And that is using a couple of different stages. One is capturing any kind of flood waters that come in, and Hoboken is at sea level or below sea level. So you're capturing water that comes in from the ocean in the case of a severe storm. You're cleansing it, and then you're releasing it, because when water comes in and then rushes out, it carries with it any kind of oils, trash, whatever it is in its path, and returns that to the river. So you capture it, you clean it, you filter it, and that involves things like berms, more parkland to capture water, as well as literally having walls that will come up in the event of the forecast of a severe storm coming through, a hurricane coming through.
So these are actual gates that come up, floodgates?
correct.
I worked in Georgetown many years ago when I was at the Urban Land Institute, and down on the waterfront, they have those gates. And of course, there was a great flood. This is about 13 years ago in Georgetown with the Potomac River, and the gates malfunctioned, and everything, the river was, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet above its normal level, flooded. And then years later, I actually saw the floodgates up, and I was so relieved that they were able to address that, because it really has a tremendous impact. Vanessa, the Puerto Rico received the largest allocation in the history of the 30-year history of CDBG-DR for long-term recovery, but also received the largest allocation of mitigation dollars. As an architect, can you talk about what you hope to see these dollars used for, and are you optimistic about the projects on the horizon in Puerto Rico with mitigation dollars?
Well, we as the Puerto Rico Builder Association has always been concerned about the large amount of informal construction in Puerto Rico. Informal construction meaning all those houses that were built on unsecured land, not following codes and regulations. So we certainly hope, and we're starting to see that all of these funds that are allocated for construction per se actually promotes not only the construction of safe and affordable housing, following codes and regulation, but also educate the people into what is a safe construction and following codes. We understand that we are still going to have people in the suburbs that are going to be building their own houses, or actually remodeling their houses on their own. So we do need to educate them to make sure that they actually understand the importance of building following codes and regulations. As to the mitigation, disaster recovery in Puerto Rico, industry is totally new, right? It started 2017 after Hurricane Maria and Irma. We do have also the mitigation allocation for us is really important, because we do have, following Fiona, several communities or areas that are more susceptible to flooding. So we do need to also take that into account. How do we move them, or how do we mitigate those flooding in those areas? I am hopeful. Yes, I am very, very hopeful that we as a nation, as an island, are going to be able to use this money correctly to actually provide safe, affordable housing and to promote a sustainable economic development in Puerto Rico. I am hopeful, yes.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. Sandra, you have the longest tenure in disaster recovery, and prior to Hurricane Irma and Maria, Louisiana had received the largest allocation of federal funding following a disaster. The Road Home program being the first major program, I do remember a lot of discussions about elevation of homes in Louisiana. Can you share your experience with the elevating of homes and what's worked and during the Road Home and any subsequent allocations?
Sure. Just to give it context, Hurricane Katrina, Rita, there were 140-mile-per-hour winds. 80% of the city of New Orleans flooded, and we had 1,800 fatalities, unfortunately, with 400,000 folks that were basically homeless. And so with the Road Home core program itself, there were three options. Homeowner could take the buyout and rebuild in place. The second option was take the buyout and move somewhere else in Louisiana. Naturally, we did not want to lose any residents. Or the third was to take a discounted buyout and they could move anywhere. After that, though, came the elevation grant. And that was a $30,000 elevation grant for individuals who needed to elevate, let's put it like that. Unfortunately, $30,000 was not enough. You were finding that a lot of these homes were on slab. They needed to be elevated 2 to 3 feet. They had already finished their renovations in most cases. Some of them, frankly, which is where some of the issues came in, had to use those funds because they didn't have any other resources to actually finish renovating their house so it was livable. That said, elevation has worked across the board, particularly in South Louisiana, where we have so many flood zones and floodplains and flooding. We have looked at elevation as one approach for that. We also did buyouts, as Liz has indicated. We, of course, relocated the Ile-de-Jean, St. Charles tribal community and completely relocated them. We relocated an LMI senior citizen community called Pecan Acres that had flooded something like 17 times and flooded every time a cloud appeared in the sky. We successfully relocated them within the city of New Roads because for seniors it was important that they had access to their own health care, their sense of community, etc. We now are running individual buyout homes, buyout programs in local communities. Many have asked for that. You know, at one time buyout was a dirty word, but now it's so popular because it offers a resource that otherwise probably would not be available based on the market in that given community for those types of homes. So it is offering a lot to them. And we have found that the receptivity of it has been very open and very warm, both for the individual homeowner, for this voluntary, but also for the local community, because that gives them land to create retention ponds or other green space. And it also mitigates the response expense and time, if you think about it, to not have to go and rescue folks who are in those type of situations during a major storm.
Thank you, Sandra. Just last week, Secretary Fudge made a major announcement about a reorganization at HUD that I am so excited about. When I was Deputy Secretary, I chaired the disaster management group, but I was informed by the attorneys that we were not able to staff that office, that it would be a violation of epic proportions. I mean, they really scared me. So we did our best with the disaster management group by having people attend meetings, but staying in their own, if you will, offices. So the secretary and Deputy Secretary Adrian Todman went through a formal reorganization, which is not a small task in the federal government, to formally establish an Office of Disaster Management in the Office of the Deputy Secretary. So I'm so pleased to see that. Not something that can be undone easily when the next administration someday comes in. It's so important that they be able to activate that, not just activate it, but keep that group ongoing, and then be able to come together quickly in the event of a natural disaster, which we know is on the horizon. We just don't know when. And they also elevated the Office of Disaster Management within the Office of Community Planning and Development. And we are so fortunate to have Marion McFadden, probably the most experienced federal official at HUD. She was the attorney during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. She was the one that was advising us in the Office of Community Planning and Development what we could and could not do, and was incredibly creative. I remember her allowing us to reprogram some recaptured UDAG dollars. Sandra, you'll remember the UDAG program from many decades ago, but that money was utilized immediately and was deployed to Louisiana. So we're very fortunate to have Marion McFadden heading up the Office of Community Planning and Development with her many decades of experience now. Recently, Marion put out, the Department of Housing and Urban Development put out a request for information asking the public, professionals such as Sandra and Liz and Vanessa, to provide feedback on the CDBG DR program, a program that does not exist except for appropriations law. And sometimes Congress acts very, very quickly, and sometimes Congress acts very slowly. But we pretty much rewrite the rules every time, through a Federal Register notice. Very, very awkward. So this RFI went out, and there were some very serious questions that they posed to the public, asking for feedback. So would love to hear from one of the three of you, or all three of you, if you had a magic wand, or if you were able to give advice to Marion or the Deputy Secretary or Secretary today on what would you change about CDBG DR to make the program more effective and efficient, and to reach disaster recovery survivors sooner, even though it is meant for long-term recovery. But I don't think anyone ever defined long-term as long-term as it is. So what would you have to say? Certainly you're going to share this with them.
Well, I can start. I don't have enough experience to come up with a magic wand solution. I do know that for us in Puerto Rico, being new right after the Hurricane Maria and Irma, the disaster recovery industry, it's just came in. We have a lot of problems, or we have a lot of hiccups with the startups, meaning this whole process of learning all the regulations, all the programs that could be made, all the how to assemble the whole thing. I think that was kind of one of our biggest challenges at the beginning, and we have been hearing from the media, from everyone, concerns about how slow we are in the process of implementing all of these programs. But the truth is that it took us maybe 2.5 years to actually understand the whole thing, the whole concept, all of the whole regulations. So I assume that these new offices that HUD is going to establish could be that liaison between these new governments that are, starting with this recovery, how to help them, how to deal with them in a more easier and streamlined process, so it won't take so long for us to start implementing and using those funds.
Thank you. Liz, do you have any suggestions for HUD on how we could reform the CDBG DR program, including codifying it into law, which obviously we don't have the power to do, but we can certainly encourage Congress? How do you feel about that?
I think that, as you noted, with respect to the various administrations that come in, there's a different emphasis, there's a different focus in terms of policies. And I think codifying this into law would stand to, again, establish the rules and have consistency of the rules over time, would certainly streamline the process, and may in turn, you would think, get aid out there earlier.
Great. And Sandra, your advice for HUD on this program, including codifying the program?
Absolutely. I think that overall it is a great step. As you mentioned a little earlier, it takes a little too long for Congress to make that allocation for those particular storms, just like this last one. And meanwhile, people are technically suffering, and communities are dying. Our state, Louisiana, works quite closely with COSTA, the Council of State Community Development Agencies, and Pat Forbes, our executive director, was chairman of the Disaster Recovery Committee over the past year or so, and just recently passed that baton over to the state of Texas with Heather LaGrone. But we've been looking at that through that committee collectively. There are some fine tunings, I think, that could go with that act and the codification, one of which is that requirement that the 70% LMI threshold, which sounds good. However, for large scale infrastructure projects where the LMI in a given community may not be sufficient for the large scale infrastructure projects that need to go into place, that perhaps there's or that area wide recovery, because after all, disasters don't know political boundaries, they don't know geographic boundaries, they don't know income. And so to be able to serve that community and that region as a whole, we were suggesting that perhaps it should be reduced back to 50%, perhaps with some other trade-offs, but that that waiver, I think, would be essential, at least in the infrastructure programs, in order to address both the short-term and long-term. How could you say, the acceptance or sharing of the environmental reviews, they can be quite onerous and tedious and costly. That it again protracts the recovery process. And so we were suggesting that perhaps the primary agency, particularly where there's matching funds, accept the reviews and requirements of that matching agency, so that we could, again, get on with the business of it. We were able to achieve that with the FEMA PA match and having a global match. But that, you know, this is getting into the weeds, the operational aspects of it that perhaps some folks have not yet experienced or to know how it could impact their particular profile of their community. And so I just thought I would share a few of those. And then the financial certification, once those allocations are made, you have states that are like us and states that are coming to the fold, unfortunately, that have experience in managing these funds. And so if there's no major concern or audit finding, they should be able to proceed with the existing certification that they have. And perhaps progressively on another scale, those new grantees that are coming in could have some level of review and certifications, as we certainly want to make sure those funds are being managed correctly. But that is another impediment to the actual utilization of the funds. And I think from a individual standpoint, the residents that are suffering, and then from a political standpoint, folks don't understand this step-by-step process to utilize those funds. And that even once the allocation is made, that it's not money in hand as of yet. That is not programs that have been approved and money that can be spent quite readily. And so I think over the past few years, we've seen that then that factor has been a big impediment to rolling out programs, particularly when you have experience, when you know exactly what your community needs. And there should be some temporary release, if you will, that can be implemented so that we can move forward. That could be a portion, is immediately available. And if so, there's another issue too in terms of the 5% cap on administrative funds. Ramping up a program, just like we were discussing a little earlier, is costly. And in order to do that, sometimes you're going to need more than just that 5%. And so there needs to be a little more flexibility in that based on the amount of money that might be available.
Excellent advice. I used a timeline to be able to, when I would meet with elected officials, and this was after I left HUD, obviously when I was in the thick of things, I couldn't even consider a codification of the program in the aftermath of Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The Inspector General's office had been working on that. And I kept saying, we can't deal with that right now. We have to deal with that later. So we definitely need to be dealing with codification, not in the middle of, you know, an enormous natural disaster, but working on it now, you know. And I think there is a real appetite for it, both in Congress and at the executive branch. So that was great feedback. I know one of the things that shocked me on, I think it was day 2 of my 4th and final tour of duty at HUD, it was a meeting at FEMA. And I was not aware of the friction between HUD and FEMA. And I'm not saying that these weren't even personalities. It was just FEMA operates under different rules than HUD operates. And then, you know, a few days later, I found out there was friction with SBA, you know, duplication of benefits. So what advice would you have to be able to make sure that those 3 major disaster recovery programs and agencies that are involved in disaster recovery work in harmony, and you know, that the short-term recovery with FEMA is seamless with HUD's long-term recovery? Liz, or do you have any comments, or Sandra or Vanessa?
Actually, Pam, can I just, before answering that question, can I just touch on something? Because I don't want to lose the thread that you had mentioned.
Absolutely.
When you were
Please,
talking about Marion being elevated and Secretary Fudge. And I had worked on Wall Street for many years, which is obviously a male-dominated industry. And the top, you know, investment banks are dominated by men, which may explain a lot. But, but anyway,
you like a challenge.
Also, your managing partners at firms are typically male to this day. But I looked at HUD's hierarchy. So obviously, Secretary Fudge leads HUD, but the deputy secretary, chief of staff, the 2 deputy chiefs of staff, and the heads of the Fair Housing Authority and the FHWEO are all women. And if you look at FEMA, the administrator is a woman. At the top, the org chart, top 4 boxes of the 9 titles up there, 5 are held by women. So I think it's really encouraging, because if the leadership is women, I think that bodes well filtering down more to the rank and file and to opportunities, and why disaster recovery may be a little bit different in terms of promoting women and in terms of inclusivity than perhaps some of these other fields are.
Liz, thank you for noting that, because it is the first time where we've had a female secretary and a female deputy. There's only been 3 female deputy secretaries, but all the way down the line, Julia Gordon at FHA. FHA plays a huge role in the aftermath of a natural disaster, and we didn't touch on the other type of disaster, but the pandemic, which many of you have also been in, with the billions. Not even billions, trillions of dollars that were spent during the pandemic. Do you, Liz? I didn't want to cut you off. If there's any advice with the coordination of the 3 agencies, but also, and maybe segue into the dollars that were spent and continue to be spent, the COVID-19, because the same agencies were also
right. And actually, it was. And when we were talking about getting funds out as quickly as possible, and obviously there's always a tension there between getting the funds out quickly and, you know, these are taxpayer dollars. We can't just spew them willy-nilly, that you have to have transparency. And it was kind of interesting with the COVID monies that the U.S. Treasury essentially suspended NEPA, you know, the National Environmental Protection Act too. Now, that's, you know, again, not without some friction or without upsetting certain constituencies, but I think to the end being, the goal being to get the funds out there as quickly as possible, that, you know, that was a step that they decided to take. I think in terms of the coordination, what I would like to see with respect to FEMA, HUD, and the SBA is, and I realize right now certainly there's a concern about protecting data, protecting particularly PII. but I think it would be tremendously helpful if there could be a more, I don't know, an easier interconnectivity of data between SBA and FEMA and HUD. It would certainly make our lives much easier, and I think it would be so much easier for applicants. And we had folks, it really came to roost during Sandy, who had applied for SBA loans and assumed that their data, it's the federal government, so my data's in there. So then when it came to HUD, applying for funds here, they had to reapply. You're creating a duplication of benefits potential problem. So I think if there was some way to, again, protecting the data, but to have some way to have a smoother connection, or I think that would be tremendous.
That's great advice. There's only so much human capital, dedicated to these
Yes.
resources at the state and
Exactly.
local jurisdictions. Time is money, and I think for the disaster survivor, whether it be during the pandemic, when businesses were completely shut down by no fault of their own, but time matters. I would receive calls almost every day from people saying, "Can you help me with this?" And my experience with SBA was very, limited, but I would go online and have a hard time deciphering sometimes what the directions were for applying. Vanessa, I know that Puerto Rico, I'm so proud to say, has had one of the most successful HAF programs. The Home Ownership Assistance Fund program was developed and administered by Treasury, and I would say very, very, very effectively. I hope you would all had good experience, with the HAF program. But Vanessa, do you want to talk a little bit about that program and how quickly the funds were deployed in Puerto Rico?
Definitely, yeah. It came when the pandemic came, it was like a perfect storm. We were just starting disaster recovery after Maria and Irma. We just got that January 2020, we got earthquakes, and how are new in our, I mean, it's not new, but recently new in our disasters, environmental disasters, and then came the pandemic. So we were kind of shaking as a community, right? A lot of PTSD happening. Pandemic came and everything was closed from one day to the other. We had very few services that were declared as essential. Construction was not one of them. So you can imagine everything was closed, streets were empty, people were locked out at home without wondering what would be next. Where would I get my funds? How would I be able to pay off, their responsibilities? So it was a good thing. We were not used to receiving funds so rapidly, right? We had just gotten through the experience of the CDBG-DR funds that took forever. So it was really good move that we got them so fast, and people actually were able to make their payments and secure their homes, which is something that is really important if you want to work with the mental security and safety of our population, which was so fragile at that moment with everything that has been hitting on. So yes, it came in a good moment. It came good, and it actually helped us overcome other obstacles besides the physical impact of all the events that were happening.
Great, thank you. Sandra, have you had experience with COVID dollars in Louisiana?
Yes, we got both the homeowner and the rental assistance. We got 146.7 million for the homeowner program with a cap of 25,000 per household. It's been very successful. We're in the process of doing recertifications for those that were in good standing, where they potentially can get an additional 3 months of support through the program. We did not extend the payments on utilities that we were able to pay. And then on the rental program, and a lot of times the impact on folks who are renting is overlooked. So that was major that we were able to get that in process too. So We had 101,000 applicants that were started, 46,000 were submitted. We were able to approve and get in process for rent payments over a little bit over 28,000 for 156 million, a little bit over 156 million. We ran into a few hiccups for both programs. One, we didn't expect the landlords to not want to participate in some cases. That kind of created an impediment, but we were able to work through that for the most part. And then with the homeowner assistance, some of the banks also were not willing to participate, surprisingly. But you know, once you sat down with them and had just a regular conversation with them, they were able to see the value and agreed to participate and accept the funds.
Wonderful. And Liz, your experience in New Jersey?
Yeah, I was about to say one thing that we did, and our same thing, our eviction prevention, mortgage assistance, rental assistance programs also performed very well, and I think met the goal in terms of that funding. And one thing that we did in New Jersey that I think was really helpful, maybe best practice, is we were able to coordinate with the courts. So we would hear
eviction courts.
Yes, with the courts in terms of the actual names of folks, so we could have some outreach and intervene to make sure that they were not homeless, basically homeless on the street. And with respect to tenants, we actually had resource navigators in the courtroom who, upon notification that these individuals would be in the program, drafted, in effect, promissory notes for landlords to say, this money is coming. It may be 14 days, but you will be receiving this funding. So don't evict so-and-so. They're up for eviction, to try to preclude that. So I think having that intervention worked fairly well and prevented what would have been certainly a rise in homelessness.
Liz, thank you. I'm sure Matthew Desmond, the author of Evicted, is very proud of the work that New Jersey has done. The Eviction Lab right there in Princeton. Speaking of Matthew Desmond, his newest book is going to be released today on poverty in America. Well, thank you all three of you for your passion. It's not just a job. It's not a 9-to-5 job, but it is a job that I believe is very rewarding. You're humanitarians for being involved in some of the nation's largest natural disasters. And as we prepare for the 2023 hurricane season, which is not too far away, I know Vanessa thinks about that every day.
Yes.
Sometimes the hurricane season is longer, starts earlier and lasts longer, and where to go. But some of the most vulnerable of populations are very hard to reach. And are just our last couple minutes that we have together, if you could share some of your best practices, how you're reaching some of the most vulnerable populations following a disaster, or even in advance of a disaster.
In our case, with the Puerto Rico Builder Association, we've been doing that through NGOs. And it has proven to be extremely helpful, especially after Fiona. We have, like I've mentioned before, PTSD with the hurricane season coming up, and people are still, some people are still vulnerable in this, physically vulnerable in the sense that their homes have not been repaired or they have not been relocated. So right after, we have made a lot of agreements with different NGOs to help those people that do not qualify for X or Y in these federal funds. Either they don't have title, or they don't know how to access those funds, or they just don't want to wait so long for to repair their houses after a disaster event. So through NGOs, we have been able to reach those people, those families, very quickly, and start to mitigate the impact, the mental impact of having to go through another event and not being able to recuperate from the first one. So I think our collaborations with the NGOs in Puerto Rico has proven to be very successful, and we are vouching for that to cover that gap of people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for participating today. Sandra?
We work very closely with our Governor's Office of Indian Affairs to make sure that the tribal communities are involved, that they have a connection with their local jurisdiction and EOC office in terms of preparedness and training. We also are instituting sustainable building standards in our programs that we run ourselves and in any grant that a homeowner may receive. We also are looking at data. I mean, that's critical to have good profiles of your community, to know where you're vulnerable communities and individuals. So we have a data task force that we created right after Hurricane Ida that we're working on. It's across jurisdictional lines. It's across different issues of economic development, health and human resources, infrastructure, et cetera. And of course, we have our Louisiana Watershed Initiative that we instituted after the 2016 floods. So we are doing a data modeling of the entire state. We're working with local jurisdictions. So it's a sharing of information and data and processes where they have local control. At the same time, we're providing them with technical assistance on the type of data, the type of mitigation projects that need to be instituted. And that is working very well, because in that, naturally, that is where our vulnerable communities lie and that tend to flood the most. We've had areas flood that have never flooded before, and so that's reaching other individuals too. But we also want to, through our different programs, collectively collect data so we have a good profile of our communities and we know which ones are subject to and most vulnerable to the impact of these disasters.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for participating and sharing your wisdom, decades of experience helping disaster survivors. And Liz, you have the final word.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of the Ida recovery, one thing that we did was we set up a survey, sponsored a survey, worked with community partners to engage the local community. You know, what do folks need? How have they been impacted? That went into our design of the program and allocation of resources within the program. Specifically with respect to the LEP population, we looked at the census data for the HUD declared MIDs, and we're able to produce materials in 9 different languages that would be appropriate for those specific communities. And again, worked, the theme throughout this is working with the local community groups to spread the word, to again, for the survey, having registrations outside the Walmart on a Saturday morning in hard-hit communities, hard-hit towns. And what that's also afforded us is, as we started to roll out applications for the largest housing recovery program, we had from these survey registrants emails with which we could get the word out that the application's coming. So, so pay attention, make sure you fill us out and submit this to us. So I think on many fronts, we've been trying to move in an intelligent fashion and try to provide the community with what they need, hearing from them and providing them what they need.
Well, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to celebrate Women's History Month with all 3 of you today. And thank you again for sharing your lessons learned. And we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.